I'm really happy to welcome you back to Rooted in the Caribbean, our Women in Leadership series. Today, my guest is, I would say, the incomparable Abrilli Phillip. Abrilie most recently was the Director of Education and Learning for the London Borough of Lambeth and is now an educational leadership consultant supporting public sector education institutes. She has over 2 decades of educational leadership in middle, senior, and executive level management. Abrilie is a primary trained teacher. She started off her career at a junior school in Wiltshire but has uniquely taught and led across phases of education, with most of her teaching experience in the secondary and post 16 phases as a social science specialist. Abrilie has held a range of leadership roles, including Headship and CEO of a 0 to 19-year-old academy trust in Wiltshire. Before moving into local government, Abrilie worked for the Ministry of Defence Schools as the Chief Educational Officer, leading 21 schools and early years settings across 10 countries. Abrilie is a proud Trini, born in Trinidad and Tobago, where she lived for 22 years, and holds a BSc degree in sociology with psychology from the University of the West Indies and an MA in global sustainable education from the University of Reading. Abrilie is passionate about inclusive practices in education, but also has a real passion for girls' education, previously holding senior leadership roles in 2 community girls' schools in London and Portsmouth. Abrilie has mentored Black middle and senior leader women as part of the Southwark Teaching Schools Alliance and future leaders in the past, and understands both through lived experiences and interactions with other women the challenges they face in accelerating their careers. She's a proud mother of her amazing daughter, who is an amateur singer-songwriter and outstanding netballer, who recently started her A-level studies doing history, sociology, and English language. Welcome, Abrilie. Welcome to Rooted in the Caribbean, our Women in Leadership series, and today my guest is Abrilli Phillip. Abrilie is a dear friend of mine, and I'm really excited for you to just meet her and so that we can explore her journey as a woman in leadership. Abrilie, welcome.
Good afternoon.
So it's actually warm today in the UK. I am making the most of it. So,
Yeah, that's
like
so
you,
fun.
I'm showing off the one plant that is actually alive in my house at the moment. So,
I am a bit of a plant mom, not to show off, but there we go.
you have quite a few, right? So, really, the question I ask all my guests is specifically, tell us about your Caribbean roots. I've just recognized that over the years, I've met and known and become friends with so many phenomenal women who just happen to have Caribbean roots. And talk to us about yours.
Right, Trini to the bone. Proud Trinidadian, and it's always interesting. I think when you, and I'm sure you've experienced this, when you travel to the UK, and you take up home somewhere else, there's sometimes this funny place where you feel like an alien. You
Yeah.
don't feel, in this case, British enough, and sometimes when you go home, you don't feel Trini enough. And I'll give you like a really simple example. My mom was talking about Eid this Sunday. I called her, and she said, "Well, the holiday is on Sunday." But in Trinidad, and I said, sorry, what? We mean in Trinidad? Because I realized she's going to explain to me that when a holiday is on a Sunday, they give it the Monday. I said, excuse me, where was I born? Where did I grow up? Calm down. And I think people sometimes forget,
Yeah.
that you grew up there and left there at the age of 22. Come on, I could tell you about Eid Mami,
Yeah.
So, I think for me, there is sometimes that struggle in terms of people even recognizing your identity, but I know exactly who I am.
Amazing.
Grew up in Malabar, Rima, the east side of Trinidad, went to Northeastern College in Sandy Grande in the bush, as they like to say,
Not quite a bush, but
bushish. It's close enough to Toku. But I think, for me, that has created who I am
yeah.
as a person. And I think, having, and being born and grew in a time in Trinidad where I still think Trinidad was a paradise, where you would look at the rest of the world and say, my goodness, I'm lucky to be born, and growing in this place. When my entire school and educational experience was in Trinidad, went to
Yeah.
UE. So for me, Trinidad is home. And actually, what's really poignant is this year's 22 years in the UK. So I've spent
Oh,
exactly half my
wow.
life in both
In
countries,
both.
but at the end of the day, as you could tell from the accent, and everything else, Trinidad is home and it always will be. And I think, even raising my daughter who has a Trinidadian father as well, and having that identity, she will come on a Sunday and say, what we eating today? Callaloo, macaroni pie,
Right.
gift that I was given from my last workplace was a picture of people winding down low on Carnival.
Oh,
It's who I am, and it will always be who I am. But I am grateful to be in the UK and have that as a second home as well.
yeah. And do you think that your roots from the Caribbean have translated into how you show up as a female leader? And specifically because I see you as a real, as uber confident woman. You're unapologetic in the workplace. So do you think there's any crossover?
I think so, 100%. I think for me, oftentimes, you'll meet women who present as confident.
Mhm.
And then when you kind of get to the roots of it, they're oftentimes, not always, they may be overcompensating for insecurities they're carrying or maybe imposter syndrome, and I'm just going to say this, and it might come across arrogant, but I don't have imposter syndrome. I believe I
Yeah.
deserve to be where I am because I've worked
Mhm.
really hard to get here. And I'm
I
always
agree.
thinking, who am I impersonating? Imposter of who? I could only be myself, right?
Yeah.
And that does have its roots in the Caribbean. I think for me, again, if I go back to those early experiences back in Trinidad, from an early age, and I tell this story, I do a lot of keynote speaking in educational circles. That's my background. And I always tell the story that when I was in Standard 1, in Malabar Government Primary School. I'm my first ever teacher and my first ever test. And those days they would rank you. They probably still do.
Yes.
And I came first in tests. And, that was a real moment, I think, for me, having
Yeah.
sort of, beaten everybody in the class and thinking, gosh, I'm top of the league. And I think that did play a part in my confidence. And although as an educationalist now, I don't
Yeah.
know if I'd recommend ranking children,
In the same way.
because actually I'm sure the person who came 25th didn't feel that way.
Yeah.
But I think for me, that was a real key moment in my educational experience and even the career choices I made. Because not just because I came first in test, but that did tell me something. It was that self-fulfilling prophecy of you are the top.
Yeah.
And as I said, it's not necessarily the same experience for the children at the bottom, so I wouldn't recommend it. But my teacher wrote something at the bottom of that report. And you remember, you would get your scores on a one line in your yellow report book. And she wrote at the bottom of it, Abrilie will do well in life. And I remember
Oh,
thinking,
wow. She didn't stop with, yeah.
what? Who says that as 7-year-old? And
Right.
those words to date are the most powerful things I think any human has ever said to me.
Right.
Because it was like this woman who I loved and adored saw into my future. She saw into
Future.
my being. And she didn't just say, I will do well in school or I'll do well this term. She said, I will do well
In
in life.
life.
And I held on to those words. And I think words are powerful. And
Yeah.
we must always remember that. But, those little things and those experiences and having teachers that believed in me throughout my educational experience in Trinidad, really, I think is the reason why I kind of show up every day and decide that I am just going to be me, take it or leave it, authentic self. And I do show up to work as myself, unapologetically, as you said, because for me, ultimately, if I'm there and I'm going to add value, I could only add value as me. I can't add value as anybody else.
Okay. And talk to us a little about your journey in that education arena, because to have someone say something so profound at such a young age, it must resonate in terms of what you say to others. So just talk to us about that journey.
So almost the opposite is exactly why I got into education. So
Okay.
kind of fast forward, at the age of 7, to the age of 16 and studying A-level sociology. And this is always part of the story that I also tell. And I remember my first lesson with Mr. Sunarang, who I owe everything, by the way. And if he ever sees this, I genuinely owe that man my life, I think. And I remember the start of the sociology of education topic. He asked a question and he said, is education equal and fair?
Right.
And I shut my hand up without even pausing. And I said, of course it is. And I said, those who work hard get the best rewards. And at that point, I was convinced it was because it was always good for me. I was that typical academic, bright, bushy-tailed girl for who the education system
was set up.
So for me, of course, education was fair. If you wanted to do well, you studied. I was hardworking. I was very, diligent, and I did well as a result. And I remember that man spent the rest of the term dismantling, every single opinion I had of equity, of meritocracy, of, fairness in the education system. And, kind of showing from an outcomes point of view, unless you were white, middle class and male with connections and probably public school education, private school in other countries, the stats was stacked against
you.
And of course I'm not white, middle class or male. So I kind of thought to myself, okay, I'm going to have to overcome some barriers, knowing that I probably could push through these barriers because I did have a certain susceptibility to do well. But at that point, it wasn't myself that I thought about. I thought about my brothers because I had a younger brother who I would say now was an educationalist, had undiagnosed special educational needs. He was also hearing impaired. And I had an older brother who would be a typical naughty child in school, who I actually think had a lot of mental health and cognition needs, and again, not diagnosed appropriately. And for both of them, I saw an education system failing them quite dramatically, and thinking they are the ones who the education system doesn't, is not fair to, is not equal for. And at the age of 16, I made a deal with myself that I would make education fair. That was fair. So that's been the journey, since the age of 16. And, I think coming to the UK was quite important in that because we had adopted the UK system. And I wanted to see how the UK system had moved forward. Unfortunately, it didn't. And it still hasn't. But I needed to be part of understanding.
Of trying to dismantle that, as you said.
To begin to repair a system that is well and truly broken, by the way. But I haven't lost hope.
And I, in doing my research before we met today, not that I don't know you, but I was looking for, a bio, and I came across a clip that you did when you were head teacher at Wellington Secondary Academy.
I think this is a really important topic and actually quite relevant in the education sector. One, because I think we're behind other sectors and need to catch up in really thinking about the importance and the significance of flexible working and the impact it can have on our schools, especially with reference to staff well-being, but most importantly, staff retention and recruitment as well. I think it's an issue that particularly affects women, but I also think it's just as relevant for men. But unfortunately, there are too many women and we're losing too many good women in the profession who oftentimes don't feel like we're flexible enough within the education sector to facilitate their demands or their needs based on requirements to be at home or to look after their children. So I do think it's something that we need to look at in terms of actually promoting more women and encouraging more women to take up more senior positions in schools or just returning to the profession on the whole.
And you were advocating for women in leadership. And that was that was more than a decade ago, or at least a decade ago. And so this has been a key part of your journey to date. But the specific thing that you were advocating for was flexibility. Why do you think that's so important for women leaders?
I feel like this conversation has come at a real interesting time. So just today I commented on another woman in leadership who I really respect. I was a member of her board. It's called sort of Women's Institute. She's not Women's Institute, but a group to really support women into leadership. A young woman. And she's just had her third child, and she'd commented on LinkedIn and shared that, she was really struggling with postpartum, but had to go back to work after 2 months because she's a breadwinner, and how difficult that was. And I reflected on it and I thought to myself, my goodness, so did I. I had to go back to work after 3 months. I was a breadwinner. I've been a single mom since my daughter was 1 and she's 18 in 3 weeks' time.
Wow.
And I think, what I had to do to make sure that my daughter didn't, one, become the statistic that I just referred to as a Black Caribbean child in the UK, where we know that's the most disadvantaged group in terms of the education system, only second
Right.
to traveler children. But I didn't want my daughter to become a statistic, and becoming, a divorcee and a single mother very early on, I had to make a lot of sacrifices, including moving my daughter's schools 8 times,
Wow.
and making lots of changes and
To
having
ensure that she was whole.
exactly. And then to work in a system that actually didn't honor me as a young woman, as a professional woman, as a single mother, as an immigrant with no family connections, and having to work in a system that actually would penalize me if I ever said, give me time
Yeah.
to balance it. So I never said it. And I worked full time, and I pushed through the system, and I ran myself ragged. And what that video doesn't show you was I got to the end of that journey in Wellington and had to actually take a pause on my life and kind of stopped working for 3 months and rescued myself from what I would say was a nervous breakdown. Thankfully, I didn't get there, because I
Wow.
was a CEO of an academy trust, working full time, raising a child on my own,
On your own.
trying to do life, and the system just didn't allow for me to work at that pace for longer than I needed to. And I think, fast forward that a little bit further, I just set up my own consultancy business.
Yay. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm working flexibly, I'm working part-time, and actually I'm having the time of my life now when my daughter's 18. But I think for me, I had to do the work to be able to get there, don't get me wrong. But again, I've had to create that system for it to work for me. And I think there's a lot we can learn about, from Scandinavian countries, or even in the Caribbean community. This. When you're a working woman, you have family around, moms there, aunties here, cousins here, neighbors there. In countries like the UK, that connection just oftentimes isn't there. We're very individualized. We don't live in the same way. And I think the system needs to also recognize that women aren't just staying at home anymore looking after babies. We're breadwinners, we're equally participating in the economy. We're leaders. But we're still expected to do what sociologists will call the triple shift, which is we work and then we take care of the sick children and we cook all the food and we clean the
And
houses.
then still show up.
Thank you. And I'm just going to put a plug here. Ladies from the Caribbean, get a cleaner. We don't care if mommy and
That is so true.
You, because mommy used to clean the house with 4 children. This is 2025. My cleaner just get a cleaner. But anyways, on the flip side, I think, besides creating those things for yourself, I think the workplace needs to recognize that actually people work much more effectively if they're happy and they have that balance. So for me, even now, setting up as a consultant, I feel happier and I feel, much more diligent, and like I'm able to give more to work because work gives to me. And we just have to recognize that somebody might be able to check emails until 6 o'clock when the children have gone to bed. And that's okay.
That's all right.
Has to flex around it. COVID taught us we don't have to be in the office all the time to be productive. No. So what could work for a working mother and father? That means they can still be good on the job, but also be there available at home.
Yeah.
There has to be more flex. If we want more women, because the statistics show us when women have children in their 30s, the gender gap gets wider, because men actually get promoted when they have children and women get demoted. Because the system
that is true.
Yeah,
that is true. I mean, I see it on the other side as some in the HR profession, but you're right. Women just have to take that step backwards and justify career breaks and justify, why they haven't just been plowing through. So you are right. And it's really food for thought. And I guess my question to you is, so advocating for women being one of the things that you've done for many, 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 many years, why do you think we still have the challenge of women not supporting others in the workplace?
I don't know if I'm going to answer the question in the way that you ask it, because I don't know if I agree with women not supporting
That's fine.
women. I think the patriarchy doesn't support women in the workplace, and that oftentimes includes other women not supporting women. But I don't think it's a personal thing. I think it's a system.
Yeah.
that essentially discriminates at the point of entry. So, I've given the example about not having flexibility about childcare, because actually we're just talking about children.
Mm.
Oftentimes women are caring for elderly parents as
As
well,
well.
and after other people in the community, but you're expecting me, to turn up. I'll give you a really simple example. There's an excellent executive head teacher I worked with in a local authority. Excellent woman, running 3 schools. She has a young daughter, single parent, and we were putting in meetings that started 8:30, and she would come
Mm.
late every single time. And one day she just said, "Can we start this meeting a bit later? I have to take my daughter to school." And nobody had thought about it. And,
Right.
but she didn't feel she could say it
Yeah.
until then.
Until that
So it's
point.
not, so I just said, yeah, like, why is this even a topic for conversation? And I
Mm.
think what we need to recognize is these systems that we create
Yeah.
discriminate at entry. And then what happens is other women see other women not speaking up, not talking about their challenges. So they
Yeah.
don't turn up authentically as themselves. They don't speak up. They don't, advocate for themselves. And therefore it's difficult for them to advocate as others.
For others.
Yeah. So I remember when I became the CEO of Wellington Trust. I'll never forget it. And the person who I was taking over from actually said to me, "If you're going to take on a job, you need to start dressing differently." And I said, "In what way?" And they said, "Well, you can wear a few more suits and stuff like that." So I just thought, as a really good example of how I was not going to take that ridiculous advice, I went to meet the board in a colorful flower dress. I wore an afro and stuck a flower in my hair. And I thought I will show up as me.
As
And
you.
I think when I've seen women go into leadership and all of a sudden the heels come out and the jackets come out. I even put a little jacket on today, but that's because I thought, why not? I do
That's
actually
fun.
wear this jacket. The jacket comes out and the heels come out, and we feel we have to talk a certain way and act, and we're not allowed to be emotive. I cry in meetings. I express, I am who I am.
Mm.
And actually, what women should have is structures that create safe spaces for them to not show up as men or as women acting as men, but as women
Mm.
acting as women. Because actually, all these statistics show that women in leadership are much more collaborative and communicative, and actually have much more greater impact, especially in failing organizations. So we just need to create safe places for
Yeah.
women to be women in the workplace.
And for other women to feel safe to
Yeah,
advocate for others.
yeah.
Um, and the reason I'd asked that question was because I had an interesting conversation online with someone else around how difficult they find it moving up in terms of um, career paths as a woman, and that, they've had excellent bosses who were women, but they didn't necessarily open doors for them in the way that they had hoped. Um, and so it was a really interesting debate, and I'm really happy that you shared that perspective. Um, what would you say? So I know what kind of was a defining moment for you as a child in the Caribbean. Career-wise, what would you say has been one of your defining moments?
Working for a woman. No, genuinely, I think what I've always had is I've always had advocates and allies
Hmm.
in men and women, and also in British white people, because I think coming as a black woman from the Caribbean, and I said this to somebody before, I think for me, our experience as black people from the Caribbean and as immigrants and first generation immigrants in most cases are very different from black British people who are born here. Because
Yeah.
we've come from a system where we've seen, matriarchy and a matrifocal society and women in charge. Unfortunately, too many single parent households, but let's just leave that there. We've had female prime ministers, female presidents. We've seen people of color, black, Indian,
Yeah.
Afro-Trinidadian in charge. So we've come and been socialized into a model of leadership that looks like us and sounds like us and behaves like us.
Yeah.
And then we come into a system where actually it's dominated by white middle class men. And actually, the school system, and I went to a conference just last week that still looks at the fact that Black Caribbean children are still being discriminated against and still being treated as subnormal and substandard. So I think we need to recognize that our experience in the Caribbean, in some ways, is an advantage because we're
Right.
not coming with that weight that
That baggage.
as a Black Caribbean person of Black heritage rather than an immigrant would have. And I think there is something in us working with our Caribbean colleagues in the workplace who are born here and recognizing their experience and lived experiences are very different. The educational experiences are very different. And I'm just kind of putting a plug there because I think what would have been an easier journey for me is not necessarily theirs. And there are many things I could say here that will not translate to somebody who may be of Caribbean heritage, but
Yes.
being born here. So I think that's the first thing. I think for me, just in terms of my key moments, it's kind of, it sits in tragedy slightly, but it goes back to what I said about my brothers. So, I came to the UK. I trained as a teacher here. I did well, got into leadership quite quickly, and then moved into a really cushy school, really, really easy, for want of a better term, in terms of having the space and ability to lead and to teach and to develop my craft. But that wasn't the drive, was it? Because my aim was to make education equal, and it's almost like
Well,
I fell off the wagon a little bit.
right.
And that was good for a moment because I was going through a divorce and I needed some stability, both financially and just mentally. And then unfortunately, my brother and father actually were killed quite tragically in Trinidad. And I remembered why I was here. And it's almost like that experience just kicks me back into focus. So I quit my job in 2012, and I signed up for a program called Future Leaders, which was working in the most challenging schools in the UK to
Okay.
become a leader of schools like that, but also supporting children and other leaders. And that was a really key moment for me. And I did a year in a school in Portsmouth that was very difficult. But it was actually a girls' school. And I think that was my first experience of all girls education. I went to a mixed
Right.
school in Trinidad. And I worked with a female leader there who, unfortunately, the end wasn't great because the school was an incredible challenge. But she actually, for me, was the beginning of really beginning to see women in leadership, because until that point I'd worked with male head teachers. I hadn't worked with a female
Right.
teacher, and I really admired her. And then I then went into another girls' school because I felt there was something powerful about that female education piece and actually developing girls to become future leaders. And I worked with another woman in a school in London, and she was just all inspiring. And I remember her saying to me, and both of them had really key nuggets that they invested in my soul almost. But in terms of the second example, she'd said to me, I really don't actually, no, the first one said it, don't be afraid to make mistakes, and
Mhm.
try everything without the fear of failure.
Yeah.
Meaning you are going to fail, but don't let the fear be a driver. And I think oftentimes as women, our fear holds us back
Back.
quite dramatically. We're
Hmm.
not taught or socialized to be as brave as men, and I'm sure you've heard the HR statistic. A man will see a job profile, could do one thing on it and he'll apply. A woman will wait until she could do nine. I'm just thinking, I'm applying if I'm not even qualified. Zero things I'm applying. I'm that level of cheeky.
I'm enthusiastic about the
I
role.
mean, if I think I can do the job, I'm doing it, even if I don't have the skills. And I think there's something in training women to make mistakes,
Yeah.
because society likes us prim and pretty, and our hair is tidy and our dress is clean and we're really nice and sweet and we don't make mistakes and we're not brave and we don't graze on knees. And actually, let some women graze some knees. Let them turn up to work dirty, not literally. You know what I mean? Let
Mm.
them make mistakes and not
Yeah.
feel like they're going to be chastised or they're going to lose their jobs. And I think that's what I'm going to keep coming back to safe spaces. And those two women leaders I worked with actually allowed me to make mistakes without fear,
Right.
and actually were probably two of the most creative experiences I had in education that actually made me a better leader. So I
Mm.
think having again that safe space for women to turn up as themselves, graze a few knees, make a few mistakes, but actually
Yeah.
learn and grow from it.
Yeah. And I mean, I know you, but I didn't realize that you experienced two losses at the same time. And I can relate, I completely understand how that moment or those moments in time really kind of draw a line in the sand. Um, but for you to translate that into, okay, now is my time to activate what the mission that I set myself is phenomenal, because from 2012 to now, I mean, the strides that you've taken have been inspiring. That's the best way for me to explain. It's been inspiring to just see the journey, um, and to now understand where that was rooted. um, is even more inspiring. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Mm.
What do you want to leave as what do you want Maya to have as your legacy as she moves into leadership
Mm.
as a woman?
So obviously, for those who don't know, Maya's my daughter, soon to be 18 in just a
Yes,
few
I can't
weeks.
believe that, but
I don't know if I could talk about Maya these days without getting emotional, because I'm in that phase now where as she is transitioning into an adult and the
yeah.
18 years is kind of coming to full fruition, I'm in a mess.
Mm.
She said something yesterday, it's Mother's Day in the UK, and she we sat down in the sun and she wrote me this card and she put on it first line, Mom, this is, your last year, being the mother of a child.
Oh,
And I burst into tears. Burst into tears. I didn't even know where it came from. I mean, sobbing. And
oh,
just kept uttering, I'm not ready. I'm not ready. I just sobbed. And she was
yeah.
in complete shock. Poor child.
Yeah, because you're not that emotional.
And she doesn't see me like that. So she was thinking, Mom, what's wrong?
What's wrong?
Anyways, and I had to pull myself together to talk to her and express, because I was trying to understand where that was coming from. And I think it's almost going back to what I said at the start about that triple shift and having to move her schools and make all of those changes. And it was almost like, 18 years goes like that. I don't even know how that's even possible, because I only look
Yeah,
23.
of course.
So 18 years goes like that. And I'm looking at this young woman who, by the way, I love and adore. I just think she's an incredible human being. I look at her
Yeah,
and I think
I
I get
agree.
front row seats to this human. I just think she's awesome. And she said to me, and she said this just as part of the bigger conversation, Mom, my only fear in life is that I'm not going to be the kind of mother you were to be, you were to me, and have the type of relationship you have with me with my daughter. And I thought, what? And I said, what do you mean by that? And she just said, I don't think I could be that good a mother like you've been. You're just
Oh,
exceptional. And I just thought, oh my God.
I
And
hear
here's
that.
my daughter carrying this weight
Yeah,
of her thinking she has to be this woman because I've set this standard. And that's a negative and a positive, because
mm,
I think in some ways she's seen me as a superhero.
mm,
And therefore, in some ways in her head, she will always fall short of that. And I
right.
think as women, we have to be careful that we don't create a superhero image, because what she also saw yesterday was the vulnerability that I haven't showed enough of. So
Enough of. Yeah, I understand.
she was going, why are you crying? And
Yeah.
she doesn't realize I've been carrying this weight for all of these years of my baby. She's
Hmm.
not going to be here. I can't just cuddle her. I can't just hold her in my arms. And I think all I want Maya to do is just be the best version of
Of
her
herself.
daughter. I don't want Maya to be me. And I said this to her in the conversation. I said, I'm kind of glad you don't look like me. I'm not glad. I'm actually annoyed. But I said to her, I'm really glad you don't look like me, because I think unconsciously I would have tried to make you a protege. And it was really important for me for her not to be that person and to
Hmm.
just be herself. And again, we have to be careful as women, because my mom inspires me in ways I think she's made of titanium, but she isn't.
Mm,
She isn't. She's human like the rest of us. And
yeah,
in seeing her as this superhero, I think there are things I took for granted. And I
yeah,
think there are things Maya's taken for granted. And she hasn't seen a lot of that pain that I've carried, a lot of that exhaustion that I've carried. And
yeah,
I don't want her to live up to my standard. I just want her to show up every day in life,
yeah.
being reflective, being a good human being, and actually making decisions that work for her, not decisions that she thinks will please me.
Will
And
please
so,
you.
so for me, the legacy I want to leave with her is, one, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
You could bust through walls, or you could
I
just chill
mean,
out.
she's
You
already
know,
done TED Talks.
I know. I want her to just think she can make whatever decision she wants to, and she doesn't have to play to somebody's playbook. That
Sure.
to me is the legacy. I think there's something in generational wealth.
Yeah.
And I've heard people saying, and especially going back to that Caribbean aspect, I've heard lots of people from Caribbean backgrounds say, well, my parents didn't help me. My children have to fend for themselves. And I'm saying, are
Mm,
you right? we need to do better for our children. Because
Yeah.
actually, my
When you
mother,
know better, you do better.
come on, my mom little 10% deposit she used to pay Republic Bank for me to go to university. That was her better. If I could give Maya something, a
Yeah.
deposit for a house or whatever it is, that means she's just in a slightly better position. And then all of a sudden that generational wealth, carries into the future. Then I've
Yeah.
done my part. And I just think, I guess having one child makes that easier. If you have more than one child, it's difficult. But it could be little things. It doesn't always have to
Yeah.
be money. But whatever we can do to give our children a leg up, I think is why are we here? Why are we in this country if we're not here to make better futures for ourselves? So
Yeah. So
that's
true.
great.
Yeah. Thank you, Abrilie. So
Mhm.
my last question is, if you had to tell little Abrilie, 7-year-old Abrilie who read that note, um, anything
Mm.
that would save some heartache or some pain on this leadership journey, um, what would you say?
God, that's a really big question. I really love my life. I really
Mhm.
do. I think too many people spend time thinking about what they don't have or where they could be.
Yeah.
And almost like that experience I just said with my brothers, I don't see tragedy as failure or a setback. I see everything in life as an opportunity. And I think if I were to talk to my 7-year-old self, I would say do it the same way.
Yeah.
Do it the same way and actually bust a few more balls, actually, to use that expression, because I think I've been too nice sometimes. Nobody might think that I'm never nice. But I think, ultimately, I think the hardest thing I've ever done has been raising a child on my own.
Right.
And that wasn't I think if I could redo life, I wouldn't do that again.
Yeah.
I would definitely recommend for women that they, really think carefully about their partners and the
Yeah.
decisions they make and the people, I was married, who they choose to marry and raise children with. And nobody has a crystal ball.
No, so you can never know.
When I met my daughter's dad at 18, I didn't know what he would be as a husband or a father. But I think there's something in growing a bit older and being a bit wise, and society allows women probably a little bit more time, whereas we probably
A little
were
more grace.
a little bit more grace, a little bit more time to really think about those kind of decisions in a way that we probably wouldn't have had growing up. And nobody pressured me into getting married. That was my decision. But I think for me, for women especially, but for anybody else, take your time, really get to understand you, live life. But by live life, I don't mean be carefree and kind of precarious. Live life. You really understand what makes them tick and what drives them. Make decisions, that have permanent impact with real thought. And
Yeah.
being a single mom has been the number one hardest thing I've done, because carrying this weight of wanting to be this good mother and also this
Mhm.
good worker and this professional
This leader.
is knackering. And I said to
Yeah.
somebody the other day, when people call me a strong black woman, it's an insult. I'm
Mm.
knackered. Stop telling me I'm strong. I am knackered, because people don't check on their tired friends. And I think, we
This
have
is
to look
true.
after ourselves. We also have to look after each other,
Each other. Yeah.
creating strong networks, which is something I have done. So I wouldn't have to tell myself to not do it, because I've done that.
Yeah.
Meeting women like you, and having people like you in my life has been a real grace to me. But I think if
Thank
I were to
you.
tell my 7-year-old self something again, I would say, I really will do well in life. Believe it.
No, that is amazing. And to your point, one of the reasons for doing this podcast, women in leadership. I mean, as you know, I have sons. So, kind of my natural inclination would be, what do I do to support my sons? But I just recognize that most of the women that I know, either with Caribbean roots or otherwise, they're okay being in the background. And I thought it was really, really important to just shine some light
Mm.
on, as you said, the hard graft that we put in to get where we are. Because you do make it look easier, really. You do. And so you're right. People don't look in on their tired friends because they think they have it together. They think that, you have it together. So Why would they? But what you've shared has been both inspiring but thought provoking because it's made me stop and reflect on how have I created that enough space for the women around me in the workplace to really show up in the best version of themselves. And so thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure. And thank you for this forum. I think it's really important. And it's inspired me actually, because I think when I talk about it and I hear myself, I ask myself the question back,
Yeah.
and really, as I said, that meeting that I mentioned, I could have made that change and I didn't, at that point because I thought it worked and I made assumptions. And I think we just need to, as professionals and leaders, reflect on our structures,
Yeah.
that we put in place because we do judge women and men at the same standard, but we expect more from women. And that's
Yeah.
just not
Yeah.
acceptable.
We expect them to be the multitaskers, but still show up in every space at the same time. Yeah. So I really thank you. I know your time is precious and I really, really value it. So
It's my pleasure.
have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. Enjoy the sunshine.
Thanks.